There we go. All right, let me pull this up. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about sexuality, and the title of my talk is God Made Love: How Marriage Redeems Fallen Sexuality. So I'm going to start with kind of a shocking and really disgusting story. This is Joseph Fritzl. He is serving a life sentence in Austria. His case emerged in 2008 when authorities learned that he had repeatedly assaulted, raped, and abused his daughter, Elizabeth. She'd borne 7 children as the result of the rapes, one of which Joseph had murdered, 3 of which remained with their mother, and 3 of which Joseph Fritzl and his wife Rosemary raised. The most bizarre aspect of this story is that these crimes took place during a 24-year period in which Joseph Fritzl imprisoned his daughter in their dirt-walled basement. And the reason that I'm sharing that story is simply because sexuality can go very, very, very wrong. And the way that God keeps sexuality from going really wrong is to create boundaries and structures in which it occurs. And in fact, the only context in which sexual expression, according to God's will, is to take place is within marriage. And that sexual expression within marriage ultimately leads to children and families. And those children and families, or those families, act as like the building block of communities, churches, and really whole societies and civilizations. So right in the middle of all that power and structure and growth of whole civilizations is human sexuality within God's plan. Such a profound thing to think about, that when we channel sexuality the way that God designed it should be channeled, there is such potential for growth and for just the wonder of human development to take place. So here's Jesus' definition of marriage. He said, "He who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." It's a profound statement. But what he's basically outlining there are 3 qualities of marriage. Number 1, it's between a male and female in equal partnership. That's how God designed marriage to function, in equal partnership. And it's a male and a female in that relationship. So it's a heterosexual relationship. And then he also designed marriage to be monogamous, between 2 people in an exclusive relationship with one another, and not including any others. No sexual expression outside of the boundary of that relationship of 2. And then thirdly, there's committal in God's definition of a married relationship, leaving the families of origin to form a new family, a new unit that then again becomes the building block of churches, societies, and even civilizations. So those 3 qualities, marriage according to God's plan, is heterosexual, it's monogamous, and it's committal, to me pretty much boil down God's intention for marriage. So that is what we call the natural, that is the basis, the index relationship, if you can say it that way, or the primary relationship that then gives place to the natural, traditional, or the nuclear, what we sometimes call the nuclear family, which is the mother and father, and then biological or adopted child or children. That is the family as God designed it to come from the marriage relationship that God designed. Here's a list of the various forms of family that we're now seeing developing in our society these days, and we call these non-traditional families. Unmarried parents cohabiting, gay or lesbian cohabiting couples with children, gay or lesbian married couples with children, single dad with child or children, single mom with children, divorced parents, and even polygamous parents. So these are some of the non-traditional families that really are not completely in harmony with God's design for marriage. Let's look at the effect of these non-traditional practices on basically on the children. how are different family configurations impacting children? That's a really great litmus test of how well things work when the vulnerable members of a society are, affected by something. So what we're going to look at though first here is how the natural family or the traditional family is really kind of on the downslope in our society today. So just some statistics for you. 1960s, 95% of babies were born to married couples. Today, only 60% of babies are born to married couples. In the 1960s, 87% of over 50 people over the age of 50 were still in their first marriage. Today, 67% of individuals over 50 years of age are still in their first marriage. In the 1960s, 73% of children were living with two married parents in their first marriage. In 2013, only 46% of children were living with two married parents in their first marriage. You can kind of see where this is going. In the 1960s, 87% of children were living with two parents, but in 2014, only 69% of children were living with two parents. Now we're going to go the reverse way. In the 1960s, 9% of children were living with one parent. Single parenting was extremely rare in the 1960s. Look how common it is today. 2014, 26% of children are living with only one parent. In 1968, 7% of parents were unmarried. Today, or around today, 2017, 25% of parents are unmarried. In 1968, there were virtually no unmarried parents cohabiting. It was just almost unheard of. In 2017, 35% of unmarried parents are cohabiting. I don't know quite how to put that. Let's see. I don't know if I worded that correctly. Anyway, you get the point. In 1960, what's that? In 1960, 27% of children were living in non-traditional families. In 2014, 54% of children were in non-traditional families. In 1960, 5% of births were to unmarried people. 2014, 40% of births to unmarried people. You can just see where the family is going. You can see that there is less and less emphasis put on the traditional family, the natural family, and more sort of experimentation going on in terms of what kind of social units will work in society. So the million-dollar question is, if we're going to look at this objectively and scientifically, what kind of families work? Do these non-traditional families work as well as traditional families? Instead of looking at statistics, because there's so many ways you can ask that question, what I did was I went to some experts and I found some statements by these individuals that study the family. That's their life work, is to study the family, and they made statements about what tends to promote the health, again, of the children in those families. So here's one quote from Mark Regeneris. Children appear most apt to succeed well as adults on multiple counts and across a variety of domains when they spend their entire childhood with their married mother and father, and especially when the parents remain married to the present day, which was surprising to me because often people will say, well, just stay together till the children grow up and leave home and then you can get divorced. But actually there's some benefit, according to this man, in the parents staying married and keeping that family line intact. That's a pretty clear statement from him. This is Sarah McClanahan, PhD, Brookings Institute. She said most scholars now agree that children raised by two biological parents in a stable marriage do better than children in other family forms across a wide range of outcomes. That's pretty plain. This is Mary Park from the CLASP Center for Law and Social Policy. She's not in human services or psychology or family studies even. She's in law, but she says this: Research indicates that on average, children who grow up in families with both their biological parents in a low conflict marriage are better off in a number of ways than children who grow up in single, step, or cohabiting parent households. And then finally, this is Brad Wilcox. I follow him on Twitter. He constantly posts studies about the family. He lives, eats, and breathes family studies. This guy is amazing. And I asked him on Twitter for a statement about this very thing, and this is what he gave me. On average, children are more likely to thrive when they are raised by their own married parents compared to a single parent. They are markedly less likely to be suspended, arrested, or depressed, and significantly more likely to graduate from college and be successful as adults. So I think it's fairly obvious, looking at these statements by these experts, that this war on the traditional family is not serving us well as a society. So as a result, I'm very concerned about the, quote, war on the family, but I'm even more concerned about the war within families. And that's how we're approaching it. I'm not trying to lobby in a political or social context so much as I'm trying to help build families from the inside, because that's my area of expertise. And there is a war on families, particularly in the arena of sexuality. 1 in 9 Americans use pornography regularly. Over $3,000 is spent on pornography every second on the internet. And notice that it is spent on pornography. There's a lot of free pornography on the internet, but over $3,000 a second is spent on pornography. So it gives you a sense of how prevalent the pornography problem is. 1 in 5 internet searches are for pornography. Among married men, 75% used porn in the last year. And shockingly, in married women, over 50% used porn in the last year, according to one study. According to another study, about 2/3 or 64% of professed Christian men use pornography. Sad, 1 in 5 youth pastors use pornography regularly, according to one study, and 1 in 7 senior pastors use pornography regularly. This is a despairing picture. And we can see warnings against this in Scripture. Drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well, said the wise man. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be only for your own and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breasts satisfy you at all times and always be enraptured with her love. For why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of a seductress? You know, I hear sometimes that pornography is not adultery, that adultery is with a person, so pornography isn't as serious. Let me just assure you that those people in those images, or I should say it this way, those images are people. And to use pornography is to not only, in a sense, violate those people, even if they're willing, but the reality is that many of them aren't, because the pornography industry is supported by trafficking. And women and children are trafficked into it. And by using pornography, even if the images you're looking at happen to all be people that are there of their own free will, you're still supporting an industry that is supporting the trafficking underground. Do you want to be part of that? In that sense, I think pornography is even worse than adultery. So I don't think you can say that it isn't a person. Those are people. Let's talk about how sexual addiction works. I know this is very serious talk, you guys. I promise it'll get more positive as time goes on. But let's talk about how sexual addiction works. And I'm just going to simplify it by talking about 2 brain chemicals. One is oxytocin, which is a bonding hormone, and the other is dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that mediates the experience of pleasure. What happens in sexual addiction is the use of the sexual response causes a person to become really kind of addicted to their own dopamine, because you're overusing that sexual response. And whenever you increase the usage of something, you start losing sensitivity to it, and you need more of the same thing to give you the same rush. We call that tolerance or desensitization when we're talking about street drugs. Well, the same thing happens when you use drugs that your own body produces. Look at the opamine in dopamine. Look at the OPA and think of this as a naturally occurring opiate. It's your own inner heroin. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? This is Tim Clinton, the director of the American Association of Christian Counselors. He said the brain develops a tolerance for naturally occurring opiates, though dopamine may be the hormone that creates the instinctive pleasure of love and attachment. It is oxytocin that makes it possible for that pleasure to last for longer periods of time. Now, I want you to notice something about this statement, because he's kind of talking about the fact that sex can become very addicting in his first statement. He says the brain develops a tolerance for naturally occurring opiates. In other words, you can become addicted to your own inner, quote, heroin. And that's how sexual addiction works. But then he says that dopamine may create that pleasure, but that oxytocin, that bonding hormone, sustains the pleasure of that dopamine for a longer period of time. In other words, in the context of a bonded relationship, such as you guys have the opportunity of enjoying in marriage, you're going to experience more pleasure from the same amount of sex. In fact, the statistics are quite striking, and let me get into some of the mechanics of that for a moment here. Let's look at the hormone prolactin. Your body produces prolactin after a high protein meal. It produces prolactin. Mother's milk has prolactin in it. After baby's nurse, both the baby and the mother have higher levels of prolactin. And individuals in a bonded relationship experience a boost in prolactin after a sexual encounter, particularly after orgasm. So here's the thing, is that they've measured how much prolactin is in the body after bonded sex with a partner and solo sex, like masturbation, pornography kind of sex. And the amount of prolactin with the bonded partner is 400% higher. In other words, 400% more satisfaction when you make love with an actual partner instead of just quote unquote making love with yourself. So God knew all this about sexuality. He knew that it was in one way a can of worms. It could lead to so much despair and horror, like we read at the beginning of the meeting with that horrible event happening with, or series of events with Joseph Fritzl and his daughter. I mean, sexuality can go so wrong, but it can do so much good for humanity. And so this is part of the reason God creates boundaries on it. He wants sexuality to do what it was designed to do. So I like to use the analogy of fire. You know, fire within boundaries is a wonderful thing. It keeps our earth warm. It keeps our food growing so that we can live. Fire within boundaries brings life, but fire allowed to rage outside of boundaries, the very thing that brings life, will bring death. And that's how sexuality is. So that's why God wants us to keep it in boundaries. He says, "You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." Notice that God is not a God that is stingy with pleasure. He's a God who is generous with pleasure. He wants us to have more pleasure, not less pleasure. And in fact, that pleasure is going to last for longer periods of time in a married relationship. God wants more pleasure, not less. Sex is perfectly calculated for both men and women to learn unselfishness and pleasure in the context of that unselfishness. So sex at its best is partners pleasuring each other and being attentive to the pleasure of the other. And in particularly, men need to prioritize the pleasures of their wives. And the reason I say that is because male sexuality tends to be quite literally quite straightforward. And women's sexuality is a little more complicated. Men's organs are on the outside of their body. Women's organs are more on the inside of their body. Men's organs are very sexual organs, and the way that they are stimulated is very direct. And in the act of sex, of love, the man's organ is very directly involved, whereas for women it's a little different, and their sexual response is a bit more mysterious, which you're going to see over the next few minutes as I identify some of the sexual response differences between men and women. As I mentioned in my email, I'm using an acronym for this. Male and female sexuality are different in their cycle, in their access, in their nexus, in their duration, and in their organs. Can do. I hope you like my acronym. I think it's pretty cool. So let's take these one by one. So in male sexuality, the penis becomes erect and climax is achieved rather quickly through thrusting. In contrast, the primary female organ of pleasure, the clitoris, hides behind folds of skin. And unlike the penis, it can't be directly, firmly handled, but requires this very gentle touch. And this makes orgasm in partnered sex a little more elusive for women. So from arousal to orgasm, the typical male sexual response takes just a few minutes, depending on the age of the male, whereas the female response takes closer to 20 minutes. And this, kind of brings to mind the country singer Conway Twitty's lyrics, "You want a man with a slow hand." There's actually a song that said that. So there's a cycle difference. Men tend to get aroused and then come to climax more quickly. Women tend to take longer. What about access? Men tend to respond sexually with more athletic spontaneity, whereas women's sexual arousal tends to be accessed less directly through the quality of the relationship and the emotional narrative and connectedness accompanying it. So let me share with you a study published in the International Journal of Impotence Research, a publication which is highly motivated to understand sexual response. The researchers used fMRIs to study brain activation in response to viewing erotic film clips, and they showed two types of film clips. The quote, mood type of film clip, which combined eroticism with a story, and the physical type, which simply showed graphic images of sexual intercourse and genitalia. This is science, guys. I don't mean this in any way to belittle men, but it's just factual. The female brains responded more to the mood type, in other words, the sex, the eroticism within a story, and the men tended to, the males tended to connect more with just pictures of genitalia. They tended to respond more to those pictures. So in other words, women's sexual response is accessed through relationship, and in particular through a relational story, a romantic story. Women need to be romanced to arouse them sexually. Men are more capable of just a random roll in the hay, and I'm sorry, it is that way. I don't mean to denigrate men, but this is just science, and it's been replicated often. So what about the nexus of sexual response? Although both sexes respond to visual sexual stimuli, sexual images activates men's reward circuitry more readily than women's. In a study from 2004, the results of which were replicated in 2014, men showed greater amygdala, which is a part of the emotional system of the brain, activation in response to sexual images than women did. And while the differences were small, and while the topic is hotly debated, we can say of men that they are visual. Consider the fact that 75 to 90% of porn consumers are male, and the majority of the stars are female. Tell me, what is the male model equivalent of Playboy that has come to anywhere close to the level of notoriety and commercial circulation as Playboy has? There's nothing close to that. I know that there are, there's male pornography, but there's nothing that comes to the level of Playboy. So I'm just saying that I think we can with some safety say that men tend to be stimulated visually more readily than women. So what about duration? We might on this basis assume that women are less sexy than men, but this is not true. Did you know that women can have endless, almost endless orgasms? Now, I'm not saying you should do this. Don't try this at home. But the rumor has it the world record for female orgasm is 134 in an hour. But women can experience multiple climaxes with short recovery periods of under a minute in between, and men, on the other hand, need a much longer recovery period to be aroused. 15 minutes maybe at age 18, and maybe as long as 20 hours at age 70 or over. So it's gonna vary depending on the age. It's true that men have longer orgasms overall, but women still come out on top in the duration realm. Women are in for the long haul. So it's not really safe to say that women aren't as sexy as men. They're just as sexy, but in different ways. All right, so another little tidbit I want to give you is the organs of sexual response are quite different. So in the man's organ, the tip or the end of the penis, called the glans of the penis, has the greatest number of nerve endings, and so is the most important erotic center of the male body. And so as such, it receives direct stimulation in intercourse. But the female equivalent of the glans or the penis, which is the clitoris in women, sits at the front junction of the inner lips of the labia above the urethra and the vagina. For most women, intercourse does not provide sufficient direct stimulation of the clitoris to bring them to climax. Most 95% of men reach orgasm through intercourse alone, but only 10 to 30% of women do. Strangely enough, prenatal androgens, and this is like almost comical, prenatal androgens, which are male hormones, apparently are responsible for the migration of the clitoris, which starts out right next to the vaginal opening, in the fetus. But then with these male androgen washes that come over the female fetus, the clitoris migrates further away, making it more difficult for a mature female to experience direct stimulation. So for this reason and many others, men need to be very attentive, because it's male androgens that made that happen. So men should be very, very attentive to their wives' sexual needs. In most cases, gentle manual or other stroking, as well as nipple stimulation, can bring a woman to orgasm. By the way, don't idealize having to have simultaneous orgasms. If you can, great, but it's not really, this isn't the Olympics. It's lovemaking. The point is to satisfy and pleasure each other. You're not performing for anyone. Make each other happy. No one is watching. This is an interesting statement from a guy named Kim Wallen from Emory University. And he's talking about this notion that women shouldn't need anything but the male penis to bring them to orgasm. He says this: "What is startling and surprising to me is that both men and women buy into the same sort of cultural model. If he's a good lover, he can bring me to orgasm with his penis alone. If a man buys into that and doesn't offer any kind of stimulation, and a man buys into that, doesn't offer, hey, she should be able to come just from my magic wand here, so to speak. And she won't say anything because it's emasculating to him. And then she feels inadequate because she didn't come to orgasm from his penis alone. And that's just a myth I want to burst. I don't want women to feel inferior because they can't respond sexually in the way that their husband does. They need a little more TLC, a little more coaxing of various kinds. That is not bad news. It's good news, actually, because our differences put us in a position, and particularly men, in a position where being attentive to the needs of the wife and unlocking the mysteries of her body, which is significantly more mysterious than his in many ways, particularly sexual response, is a really good exercise in unselfishness for him. So I just think that's really cool. And we're told, husbands, dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Your best textbook for understanding your wife's body is her. She is your textbook. And wives, don't be shy about asking for what you need, telling your husband what feels good. and what doesn't. I know you guys are all young and liberated, most of you, so you're probably already on this page. But in my generation, some women had to be told, tell the guy what you need, tell him how to do what he needs to do to make you happy. And the husband had to be brought to a place where he was willing to do that. So bottom line, guys, what are we going to do with this gift of sexuality? It all comes down to which kind of home fire would you like? Would you like this kind of home fire that brings you closer and closer together throughout your lives? By the way, there's research to the effect that the orgasms of your younger years, the sexual satisfaction you experience in your younger years actually set you up neurologically to feel at peace and relaxed in each other's presence in your later years. So even after the passion maybe wanes a little bit, there's still the effects. The reverberations continue. So is this the kind of home fire you would like? Because God would like you to have that home fire too. The kind that brings lasting pleasure and deep soul comfort. You know, it's not all about stimulating our genitals. It's about the deep soul comfort that comes in the context of a deeply bonded relationship. And the physical pleasure is the icing on the cake. But let's not animalize ourselves by making that more than or something that it isn't. God wants us to make love with our whole selves. And that's the kind of home fire we can have in the context of marriage. Or we can have this kind of home fire if we let that fire rage outside of boundaries, and the very thing that God designed should bring life will then bring death. So I know that was a heavy conversation. I would like to stop my share and then stop my recording. And then I think I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so this is the Love in the Making assessment, and you're just going to answer true or false, and it's going to give you a sense of how well you know each other in the sexual arena. And then I have a little exercise here called the sex talk exercise, where you just discuss sexuality with each other. So that will help you guys get that conversation going. All right. So